What's going on, everybody? It's ETA Prime back here again. Today we're going to be taking a look at the all-new Retroid Pocket 5. And recently, Retroid released the Pocket Mini, which is a really nice little handheld powered by a Snapdragon 865, but in my opinion, it is a bit small. It's got a 3.5-inch OLED display, which looks really good, but I wanted something a bit bigger, and the Retroid Pocket 5 is definitely the one that I've been waiting on. We've still got that Snapdragon chipset, but instead of using a 3.5-inch AMOLED display, we've got a 5.5-inch AMOLED display with a higher resolution. This is actually coming in at 1080. It only does 60 Hz, but the screen on this thing looks absolutely amazing. When it comes to the overall design, I do like what they've done here. Some people were kind of calling it a wannabe PSP, and I completely understand. I mean, yeah, if you didn't know any better and somebody came to you and said, hey, this is the brand new PSP, you might be inclined to think this is the brand new PSP. It's got front-firing stereo speakers, Hall-based analog sticks. Obviously, we've got a little bit of RGB. And around back, I mean, it's actually a really clean design. Lots of grippy texture here, so it's not going to slip out of your hand, and this is an actively cooled SoC, which means we do have a built-in fan. It's controllable from software, so we've got a lot of ventilation back here also. And just to give you an idea of that screen size difference, on paper it might not sound like a lot, but going from 3.5 inches to 5.5 is a big difference. We've also got a totally different aspect ratio and higher resolution. Overall feel here is nice, but it's still a smaller handheld. I mean, if you're used to using the Steam Deck, this is not going to feel right at home. It's much smaller and thinner, but if you've ever used the PS Vita and kind of like the feel of that, I mean, it's right along those lines. It is coming in a bit longer than the Vita, but it really does kind of seem like they took a lot of cues from that device. Up top here, we've got our power button and our volume rocker, and on the bottom, USB Type-C, 3.5mm audio jack, and a micro SD card slot. We do have analog triggers, otherwise known as linear triggers, and there's more throw here than I thought there'd be given how thin the device is. Hall-based analog sticks, and the D-pad here is using dome switches along with the face buttons A, B, X, Y. The sticks here are switch size, they're not full size because there's just not a lot of room. First and foremost, the Retroid Pocket 5 is an Android device. We do have full access to Google Play. I didn't have to do anything special here. As soon as I set the device up, I just connected the Wi-Fi. You're going to go ahead and sign in with whatever Google account you're going to be using. And if you're not into using the stock Android launcher, we do have the Retroid launcher built in. And during setup, you can opt to always boot to the Retroid launcher. From here, this is going to be kind of our emulation setup. We can set up what emulators we want to use, import games, download artwork. We've seen this on other Retroid devices. And since we're running Android, there's a lot of different launchers you could install. There's emulation front ends, so you don't have to go with that stock launcher, and you really don't even have to go with the Retroid launcher if you don't want. But along with all of this, Retroid has provided some settings here that are specific for these Retroid devices. And in order to show these, I'm actually going to connect this to my game capture. The Retroid Pocket 5 does support video over USB Type-C. So in order to do this, you will need an adapter. They're really cheap over on Amazon, but it'll do up to 1080 60 Hz. Figured I'd just use my game capture to make it a bit easier to see everything, and it does look pretty decent on a larger display. First things first, wanted to get into the software here. Swiping down from the top, we've got our quick access menu, and from here, we've got some Retroid specific settings. First one we have here is performance mode. So we've actually got a standard, performance, and high performance. I've just been running in high performance. Basically, it's just going to change the governor for us. Over here, fan control, sport, smart, customize, and I'll tell you, at 100%, this thing can get a bit loud for, how small it is. I usually keep it in smart mode. Joystick lighting, fully controllable, left and right individually. We can change our controller style right here. So if you wanted to go retro style, totally disable it, and we've got the Xbox layout. L2, R2 mode, analog, digital, or we can set it up for both. I'm usually in analog because, playing racing games, I like having that control over that gas and brake. Floating icon, force landscape, and really that's about it for the quick settings here. But there's more to this because if we head into our settings, move down, we've got our handheld settings. Power saving mode, we can set up a background process limit, connect the TV, turn the handheld's console screen completely off, and I've got mine on right now. No auto sleep, so it's not going to sleep while it's plugged in, and of course, force landscape. USB, status bar, input control, got our gamepad test right here. And so far, this has actually been working pretty decently with these analog sticks, and especially this D-pad. So it's very reminiscent of something on the PS Vita. It's using dome switches, but it's pretty accurate here. Calibrate that joystick, set the dead zones. I mean, there's just a lot that we can mess around with in here, and it's even got a virtual mouse mode. So once this is enabled, we have to set up a hotkey. So I'm going to hold down 2 keys, and I can enable this and disable it at any time. That way, when I enable it, I can actually use my right analog stick to control the mouse cursor. Google Services, Advanced, play boot music, we can disable certain apps, and so on and so on. When it comes to specific handheld settings, there's a lot that we can customize here, but now I kind of want to get into performance. I want to test out some native Android games, and especially some emulation. The Retroid Pocket 5 is powered by the Snapdragon 865. I mean, we've seen this chip for years. We've seen it in handhelds kind of just like this with the Odin. We've also got 8 gigs of RAM here, so easier to run games or very well optimized Android games are going to run perfectly on this device. Obviously, Minecraft has been out for a while. It's going to run flawlessly here. I'm at 18 chunks. I don't have to change anything. And while playing any game or emulator, if we swipe over from the right-hand side, we do have some gaming-specific settings. We can set up an on-screen FPS counter, we can kind of free up a little bit of RAM in the background, record, give us our CPU temp, RAM usage, things like that. My favorite thing here is using that on-screen FPS counter, just to let me know how well the game is running. Asphalt 9 is another game I always like to test out, and we are at 60 FPS with it. So a majority of these Android games are going to run really well. One game that gave me some issues at the ultra settings or the very high settings was Genshin Impact. I had to drop it down to medium to get 60. Still looks good on this 1080p AMOLED display. But next up, we've got Call of Duty Mobile, and one thing I noticed here was the controller automatically worked with Call of Duty Mobile. If I remember correctly, on some of their older devices, you did have to use the on-screen key mapper, but either the game was updated or their firmware, so the game does detect this as an Xbox controller, and we didn't have to do any kind of mapping with it. And the game is really smooth. One thing I'd probably do is kind of turn down the joystick sensitivity inside of the game. But right now we are at very high settings with the frame rate set to high. So we're at 60 with Call of Duty Mobile. Next thing I wanted to test out here was some in-home PC streaming. And personally, I like using Steam Link, but you could always use Moonlight. I've got this running on my home network. I'm connected to one of my laptops right now. I'm using the enhanced 1080p profile inside of Steam Link, and I've got this set to 60 Hz. I've actually been using this quite a bit, connected to my desktop and my laptop. I've had a really good time with Steam Link on this device. The Retroid Pocket 5 does have Wi-Fi 6E, so as long as you've got a good router, it should work pretty decently. One thing I always do is with the system that I'm going to be streaming from, be it a laptop or a desktop, I've always got that connected over Ethernet just to get the best connection. Obviously on this, we're not going to, run an Ethernet cable to it. You could using a USB dongle if you wanted to, but we're going to keep this totally wireless. Spider-Man Remastered, 60 Hz. As long as your PC has enough power to play it, you're going to be able to stream it over here, and it looks really good on this 1080p AMOLED. And the Steam Link application automatically picked up the built-in controller here as an Xbox controller, so everything was pre-mapped for me, but if you ever run into any issues, you can totally remap every single button on the Retroid Pocket 5 from within the Steam Link application. Now it's time to test out some emulation, and while we're here, we can also test out this D-pad. I'm using the Redream emulator. We've got Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Roll on this D-pad feels nice. I'm not a huge fan of dome switches, but if you've got larger hands, one thing I've noticed here is the D-pad does seem a little close to that left analog stick. Now don't get me wrong, I mean, it does work out pretty well, but for certain special moves, I do have to kind of position my hand just perfectly to pull them off. And I'll show you. If I could set this down. There we go. Now I can basically get it every time like this, but you can see I do have to kind of move up above that analog stick on the left-hand side. If not, I'll be bumping that analog stick every time I try to pull this move off. I like the feel of it. It's actually raised up just enough. It's got some really good roll for being a dome switched D-pad. But yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, you just kind of got to get positioned perfectly to pull some of those off. Moving over to some PSP emulation, using the PPSSPP emulator, Vulkan backend, 3x resolution. These games look really awesome on this display. So like I mentioned, I mean, if you've ever used the PS Vita or even the PSP, you're going to be right at home with this device here. And PSP emulation is kind of a treat on this thing. Again, that Snapdragon 865 chipset has been on the market for a while, and we know for a fact that PSP emulation on it works out really well. Also wanted to test out a little bit of Gamecube, Auto Modalista at 720p, so 2x resolution, and I'm using the OpenGL backend with the Snapdragon chipset. I consider this a harder game to emulate on lower end devices, and even though that 865 is a bit older, these chips do a really great job emulating GameCube and even Wii emulation using the Dolphin emulator. And by the way, this is the official Dolphin version. You could go with something like Dolphin MMJ, which does offer some extra hacks and tweaks just in case you run into a game like F-Zero GX on one of those harder to emulate tracks that may give you a couple issues on the 865 with the official version. And of course, I wanted to show off a little bit of PSP emulation, 2x resolution using the Neither SX2 emulator, Gran Turismo 4 running at 60 FPS. Okay, so here's my initial thoughts on the Retroid Pocket 5. I do like the overall design. Really reminds me of the PS Vita, and that's one of my favorite handhelds of all time. I think they've done a pretty good job with the overall layout, given the space constraints they had to work in. This 5.5-inch 1080p AMOLED display does look really good, and through this whole video I didn't even have it up past 80% brightness. It's a bright little display, and even watching videos on it is great. Some people might want 120 Hz out of this thing, but with that Snapdragon 865, I mean, 60 is going to be more than enough. But that leads us to that last thing, the Snapdragon 865. We've seen this chip in a lot of different Android phones. There's a few different tablets on the market with the 865, and this was actually released December 2019. So the chip is definitely dated. And again, don't get me wrong, it does perform really well for a handheld like this. But it would have been really nice to see a newer chip in the Pocket 5. Given the fact that the Pocket 5 is $219 over on the website, of course, you could always head over to eBay and pick up a Samsung Galaxy S20. That's got the Snapdragon 865. It's also got a larger screen, 6.2-inch, and it's AMOLED, or the Samsung Galaxy S20 FE. Add a controller, come in much cheaper, and still get the same kind of performance. You're not going to get the form factor that we have here with the Retroid Pocket 5. You could definitely get out cheaper getting an older Samsung Galaxy phone. You could actually get something with a better chipset and add a controller to it for a little less than this if you're going used or renewed. But again, it's just not going to come in this form factor. So in the end, it's really up to you. Are you after the performance, or do you like the overall look of the Pocket 5? Now, this was just my first look at the device. I will have at least one more video coming up. So if there's anything else you want to see running on this, let me know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning a little more, I will leave links to the official Retroid site down below. But that's it for this one. Like always, thanks for watching.